Hello everybody, my name is Smee and welcome back to Punk Write. Today's episode is for pantsers or plotters or anyone who's trying to get through a longer piece of writing and you're still having a little bit of trouble planning it out. Think about planning with fractals. Stick around to find out more. I find that I'm somewhere between a pantser and a plotter. You know, if I get a good scene in my head and I have my characters in a frame, I just want to go with it. I sit down and I'll write it out. But eventually it doesn't really matter because I got to go back and make some fixes anyways. And particularly if I'm looking at how those characters fit into the longer story or the longer plot line, I have to really pay attention to putting it all together. Sitting down to write a novel is a serious endeavor. You got to have a lot of patience and a little bit of faith. You got to have faith that things are going to turn out, but there's nothing wrong with a little bit of good planning too. One of the things I've learned about myself as I sit down to write as a pantser sometimes is that it's very easy to get off track and lose the vein of the plot that you're trying to follow. An effective way to ensure that your story is following the line that you want is to use the idea of plot structures with fractals. For a number of years, I struggled with trying to piece together my novel and looking at it in fragments. Putting those fragments together into fluid and cohesive plot movements is freaking difficult, man. And I stumbled across the idea of fractals as a way of designing and pre-planning your novel before you actually get into the writing. Even if you're a pantser and you've already started writing, you might want to go back and take a look at some of the key points along your writing strategies to figure out what are those major points that are really going to keep the attention of the reader to carry your plot along. What you're looking at here is called a fractal. A fractal is a mathematical object that's been widely studied over time. And the application of this to the writing process is unique. The fundamental principle of using a fractal is that you start small with some major turning points in your story, and around those points you build and add on and connect those transitions so that eventually you can create the length that you're looking for. If you're like most people, you spend a long time planning about your novel, you think about the twists and the turns, you think about how those character arcs are going to move, but putting it all together into 250 or 300 pages is a monumental chore. That part of the process is hugely important because it helps you develop and internalize some of the major movements, but actually putting it down into something fluid is a totally different step. Before you start writing, think about 4 major turning points in your story. We can think of the acronym BMOC. BMOC. No, not the big man on campus. That's a bit cliche. BMOC. BMOC stands for your beginning, your middle, a major obstacle, and the climax of your story. The filmmaker Peter Russell does a great job of outlining how to use BMOC and why it's important for storytelling. This is one of those ubiquitous qualities that you can find in story. Use it, it works. Starting with those 4 major points on your fractal, you know that you have big chunks that you can work around or work towards. From there, you're going to use the fractal structure to be able to refine those major turning points in your story and simply fill it with scenes. Ask yourself, how does my protagonist get from one scene to the next? How do they get from the beginning to the middle? How do they get from the middle to the obstacle? And if you struggle with how your protagonist fits into that scene, maybe you should consider that maybe it's not a major part of your story. You have aggregate scenes and supplements that will help you fill it in, but those you can put in later. What you're really worried about is getting through the big chunks of the novel and making sure that it all makes sense together. So after you have maybe 12, 15, or even 18 major chunks, you can start filling in those with transition scenes, and those transition scenes will help to move that story forward. And after that, make a list of some of the most essential parts to the story that you know you want to include and fit them in between those big scenes as nice fodder for your fillers. Now you've begun building the fractal. At this point, take the time, write out each scene. This is when you start to see your story really coming together and showing what they're made of. And you know that the objectives from one point to the next are going to be dependent and staked by the fractal that you've created at the beginning. Now, write the story. If you know your characters, the rest should take care of itself because you have a clear idea of the main positionings of where that character is headed in your story. I reiterate, it's important to know your characters. I've done a previous video on this. I put the link right here. Thank you for joining us here on Punk Write today. I hope you got something out of today's ideas of fractals for planning And again, check out the other videos on plot structures. I put quite a few ideas in there. If you can figure it out, well, good on you. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. If you want to subscribe, right there. You do not need permission. Meanwhile, just keep writing. Punk right!